And welcome aboard flight PSYC13024. Today we'll be cruising at a very high altitude, intellectually speaking, and at a speed that's probably way too fast. We will be travelling over ontological and epistemological systems, and if you look out of your window, you'll see that things may appear quite foggy at times, and we may experience some turbulence. This is due to the highly abstract conceptual material we'll be covering. If you do feel some nausea, please use the sick bag located on the rear of the seat in front of you, except for those travelling first class, who will be provided with a personal hand-crocheted wellness bucket and a complimentary glass of unicorn tears. When not moving around the cabin, we ask that you fasten your seatbelts. We will be arriving at an understanding of qualitative methodology at some point in the next few weeks, but no confirmed arrival time just yet. We hope you have a pleasant journey and that your flight with us is pleasant, and we apologise for any unnecessary carbon emissions that this metaphor of a flight has released into the atmosphere, which is contributing to cooking our planet to the point of human extinction.
Shut up and sit down.
Okay, yes, today we're soaring to the high planes of abstract thinking around paradigmatic issues. Now, don't fret, don't be frightened, we'll be okay. Also, you don't need to remember any of the content I'm going to cover in this part of Lecture 3 for your assessments. So why the heck are we doing it, I hear you say? Well, because it's one of the ways you can gain a deep understanding of the differences between qualitative and quantitative methods. And if you get that deep understanding, you'll understand why you're doing what you're doing, and you'll have the best chance of doing it well. Okay, now, as I promised, I will let you know what epistemology and ontology is all about. Do you need another couple of ologies in your life? Well, of course you do. Because we're doing psychology after all, isn't it? We love ologies.
Take your blah-blah to the blah-blah-ologist.
Now, understanding what epistemology is and ontology is will help map out the terrains of quantitative and qualitative research to show how they are distinct in many ways. You'll find this material in the prescribed text in Chapter 2. Now, here we find the source of the differences that we looked at previously. These are the philosophical ideas, so they're philosophical ideas, so you can't prove them wrong or right in an empirical sense. You need to decide what your ontological and epistemological position is based on belief and on good argument.
Of course. But then I like a good argument.
Now, this is the bit that causes many students to have cold sweats when we talk about ontology and epistemology. It's really conceptual, and it does take a while to get your head around it. But remember, we're going to keep referring back to this material throughout the unit, so if you don't get it first time round, we'll come round in a different way and we'll get it the next time, hopefully. So we'll keep returning to it, so don't get anxious if you don't grasp what this is all about just from this video on its own. Yeah, we'll get you there. So here we go. Ontology is all about the relationship between the world out there and us. In a nutshell, it's the answer to the question, what is reality?
He doesn't know what's real.
And there are two big answers here. One is known as realism and the other is known as relativism. And we'll look at those in a minute. Now, once you've decided what reality is, you need to answer the question, what is knowledge? You know?
Oh, well, knowledge is my reward, sir.
What is the most trustworthy knowledge of that reality that we can get? And what are the limits to our knowledge? What is knowable? And what is unknowable? You know, the known unknowns.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
And there are a number of different epistemological positions available to us, but we'll briefly look at some of the key ones for psychology, which are positivism and post-positivism, critical theory, and constructionism. So there you go. Ontology is the theory of reality and epistemology, the theory of knowledge. Simple, yeah? Nope. Don't worry, we'll get you there. Well, if you have understood it, good on you. The rest of this video might be wasted on you. Hopefully not. Right, let's first look at some of the ontological and epistemological positions in more detail. See if we can flesh it out a bit.
It's not totally fleshed out yet.
So let's start with realism and relativism. Under realism, reality sits independent of us. It exists out there, whether we know it or not. The object of our knowledge, for example, data, is independent of the subject being the observer or the researcher. So the task of research is to capture this objective reality. And this objective reality is a universal truth because it sits independently of context. So, the fact that water boils when it gets hot is not something that only exists in industrialized nations. It exists everywhere for all time, whether we're there or not to observe it. Under relativism, there's no independent reality. Reality only exists once we perceive it. It doesn't exist independently of us. The object of our knowledge is enmeshed with the subject, the observer or the researcher. So the task of research is to capture this subjective reality. This subjective reality is a contextual truth because it cannot exist outside of its own context. So I'm boiling, and I'm boiling hot again. Sweat is actually dripping into my eyes at the minute. It's still too warm. But I get boiling hot during the summer because I'm in the tropics. So you detected that from my videos. I go on about it a lot, I know. Now, that's not an absolute universal truth. It only applies to me, really, at a particular time and place. And it's about how I feel. I'm sure my body temperature is fine. I'm just grumpy when I get warm. So these two ontological systems, realism, relativism, they can't coexist. You have to believe in one or the other. You can't believe that reality is objective at the same time you believe it to be subjective. Now, once you've made a decision about your ontological position, you can then choose your epistemological position. Oh, and by the way, in case you haven't guessed already, it's been decided for you under Big Q qualitative methods that your ontological position for this unit is relativism.
Yay! That is such good news!
This is the ontological position that you need to embrace so that you have a decent attempt at qualitative methods. Now, the first epistemological position we'll look at is positivism. This sits under a realist position, a realist ontological position. And here, trustworthy knowledge has to be objective. And what is known is, or what is knowable, is that objects interact with each other in a causal linear fashion, in a cause and effect relationship. So temperature interacts with water and results in water undergoing a changed state. It's also believed that objective knowledge can be captured as long as we undertake careful systemic scientific forms of inquiry, such as the laboratory experiment.
Captain, dichloronium exists only in laboratory experiments.
Now, this is the epistemology that was adopted by the early physical sciences, now modern physical sciences. Sorry, start that again. This was the early epistemological position adopted by the early physical sciences. Modern sciences actually have moved away from this epistemological position. And there's been a shift in the ontological position as well, towards a form of relativism. Quantum physics being a case in point.
I don't believe in quantum physics when it comes to matters of the heart.
Now, positivism has also shifted in, I left my teeth out. It's shifted because it's now started to recognize that the act of observation isn't objective, that it's influenced by context. But that objective truth can still be discovered. We just have to be very sophisticated in how we go about it. And this is called post-positivism. And it's largely arisen because people didn't find it credible that any scientist could be completely free of any form of subjectivity when they undertake research. Now, both positivism and post-positivism have been challenged. If you think back to part one, you'll remember me expressing my dissatisfaction with quantitative methods when I was planning my own honours research project. That was tied to the critique that positivism and post-positivism have received. And this critique is that they are not able to capture the complexity of human experience. Our behaviours are not that simple, and are not readily explained by simple cause-effect explanations. Also, positivism is part of that ontological position that says the world is objective and separate from us as observers. But that doesn't really reflect the reality many of us experience, which is of living in a world that's inherently social and embedded with meaning. And our social context is sufficiently rich that it makes little sense to try and either observe us or make sense of us as socially isolated individuals who can be understood outside of our social context. Now, this critique is behind the increased use of alternative epistemologies that are built upon a relativist rather than a realist ontological position. And one of the key ones here for psychology is constructionism. And here, objects and subjects are seen as enmeshed, and thus knowledge is seen as something that happens when the subject interacts with the object, or knowledge is the product of an interaction between the observer and the thing that's been observed. And reality is a human construct that emerges through our interaction with our environment. This means that there's no one universal absolute truth, but multiple truths that are contingent on the contexts in which those truths were constructed. Knowledge here is seen as embedded in social, cultural, moral, ideological, and political systems of thought. Now, the political context in particular forms a central part of another epistemology that's important in psychology and is particularly important to me, which is critical theory.
Critical systems alert. Critical system alert.
Now, here are these four epistemologies in a table. Now, what I don't want to do is talk through the top two rows of this table. You can get this table from the PowerPoint slides. Those top two rows just offer another version of what I've just said. What I've just been talking about. Now, the bottom two rows bring in something new, some new topics for us. The first is axiology, which is all about how values operate in these epistemologies. And you can see that values are controlled and purportedly eliminated under a positivist and post-positivist epistemology, but they are embraced under critical theory and constructionism. If you hold to a relativist ontological position, you would say that it's impossible for any epistemology to be value neutral, because knowledge is always wedded to meaning. That is an expression of our value position.
Anything different is good.
So if you value diversity, for example, you would likely see difference positively.
Ian, I freaking love diversity.
If you value homogeneity, you would likely see difference as negative.
I think I see the world pretty much the same as everyone else.
And a realist critique of positivism would say that there is a value position embedded in that epistemology, the epistemology of positivism. And it's argued that there's a negative orientation to difference in positivist epistemology. Difference is negatively valued because you're focused on finding convergence rather than divergence in your data. And when you find divergence in your data, that's usually a problem.
Harboring divergence.
Okay, so big, heavy topics there. Again, don't worry if you don't get this stuff first time round. We'll find different ways of approaching these issues throughout our unit. Now, the final row in this table outlines the different methods that flow on from these different epistemologies. And here you get a contrast between the preferred method under positivism, which is experimentation, and that under critical theory and constructionism, which is a focus on explored lived experience. Now, social criticism is that focus under critical theory on the political context of human experience. So it's not just about capturing the lived experience, but also of highlighting how social structures operate in ways that harm people. So it could focus on a critique of social policy or a criticism of the function of social institutions like education, employment, health systems. Say, for example, pointing out how those systems discriminate against indigenous people, and so on, for the purpose of giving impetus for progressive social change. Now, this table picks up some other aspects of the differences in these epistemological positions. So the aim of research under positivism and post-positivism is, is typically, I've lost my place. Is typically explanation through prediction and control. So under critical theory and constructionism, the focus is on meaning, with critical theory focused particularly on social structures, with the aim to promote social change. Now, we've previously talked about quality. Here you see that distinction of focus between objectivity and a focus on reflexivity, our subjective engagement. Again, there's more of a focus on political issues under critical theory. And finally, we see a difference in ethics. We'll focus on ethics later on in our unit, but for now it's enough to note that ethics is seen as extrinsic, it's extrinsic to positivism and post-positivism, i.e. ethics are values, so they shouldn't impact your observation per se. But the research as a whole does need to be situated in a broader ethical framework. So that's the way that ethics is extrinsic. I'm going to give up on that word. External. That's better. Now, under critical theory and constructionism, ethics are embedded in the very nature of the data we produce. Our inquiry is intrinsically value-driven. Now, here's a summary of the Big Q paradigm that brings together everything we've covered so far. So Big Q qualitative research is words or visuals gathered and analysed in context to explore what an experience means for a person or group of people, and which engages with difference and complexity and incorporates the researcher's subjectivity in the creation of this knowledge. Now, this is the final part of our lecture. We're just going to touch on methodology. Methodology is the theory or framework that guides how research is done, how knowledge is acquired. Ontology and epistemology are about what is reality and what is knowledge. Methodology is about how do we obtain knowledge. It tells us how research should be done, how we should get a sample, how we should get data from the sample, how we should make sense of the data we get, and so on. And you can have many different methods that sit under a methodology. So for data collection, we can have interviewing and surveying and so on as our methods of data collection.
I need you to come down to answer some questions.
For methods of data analysis, we can have thematic analysis, discourse analysis, and so on. So methods are the specific techniques you use in research. The method of data collection, the method of analysis we're going to use. And the method of data collection and method of analysis we're going to use ourselves during our residential school in week 5 are the individual interview and thematic analysis. And this is when we'll be exploring the research topic of student mental health. Now, I've added 2 extra slides in our PowerPoint that will just flash up here briefly, but I won't talk through them in detail just now, because at this stage, I think you've had a lot to take in, and I want to be gentle with you. I want to pull back from this next bit, give you a little bit of space. But I've included the 2 slides just so you can have a look at them when you're ready, when you've digested the material from the 3 videos, particularly this one, which is quite heavy, as I've said. So once you've understood the materials or got a sense of the materials, then have a look at these 2 slides. And what I've done is to tease out in a bit more detail the difference between methodologies informed by critical theory and informed by constructionism. For the latter, we often find we are focused on human experience, and it's enough just to listen to people talking about their experiences and to find a way to represent those stories through our analysis and reporting. So capturing the student experience of mental health. A methodology under critical theory, epistemology, would be a bit different. This is the methodology that focuses more on how things are represented to us, how language and social practice frame particular social issues in particular ways. The focus is on critiquing those representations and finding more progressive representations that might replace them. So finding ways to challenge the ways we talk of student mental health that blame the individual for the problem. Critical theory focuses on people's experience, but it goes beyond people's stories to try to get an insight into the systems and structures that sit behind people's experiences. The types of broader social narratives that people are tapping into that may be shaping their personal experiences in ways that harm them and others. Now, the last thing to say is that what you'll find is that your choice of epistemology will not impact only on your methodology, but more generally it will impact the way you frame your research questions, i.e., rather than ask what's wrong with the student, we might ask what's wrong with the education system. So under a constructionist epistemology, we're more likely to ask what's going wrong for the student. Under a critical theory epistemology, we're more likely to ask what's going wrong in the education system. Okay, now we're not going to delve too much into critical theory just now. I just wanted you to have a brief look at it. But that's enough for now. Our brains are at risk of imploding at this point, so let's just do a really quick sum up and we'll finish. So we can all have a bit of a lie down. So we've got two different paradigms, quantitative and qualitative, and they see the world and the people in it very differently because they adopt different ontologies and epistemologies. They have different views about the nature of reality and the nature of knowledge. And thus these two broad paradigms impact the way we ask questions, we use data collection methods, and the way we treat the influence of the researcher. And each can and should be evaluated by, according to the quality of each of these paradigms needs to be evaluated according to their own terms of reference. There you go. I'm exhausted myself now. So that's all. Well done for getting through lecture 1. It's been in 3 parts, so give yourself 3 cheers. Oh, and remember, you don't need to remember any of this stuff on ontology and epistemology for your assessments, but it hasn't been a complete waste of time, because if you get this material, you'll find the rest of the unit a breeze. If you don't get it, you can still get through the unit quite brilliantly, but you might feel a little lost after the unit is over. You're trying to make sense of, well, what was all that about? Okay, so I think that really needs to be enough for now. So, the next thing to do is, just let this material sit in for a bit, and make sure you've viewed all of the 3 videos for lecture 1, part 1, 2, and 3. Make sure you've read the 2 chapters by the end of the first teaching week from our prescribed text, and then get ready for week 2, teaching week 2, where I want you to read a research paper. I'll put it up on our Moodle site. Read the research paper, and I'll set you some questions that we can discuss in our tutorial. And in our discussion, in our tutorial, it'll give you an opportunity to test out some of your understanding of some of the things that we've covered in this first lecture. Okay, so that's enough. Thanks for sticking with me. Until next time. Ta-da!